I emailed our administrator, Ms. Taryn, last week about a concept for Indiantown with regard to preserving the Indiantown fire rescue with Martin County. Do you want me to, or do you want to explain? You'd do better.
Thank you for that. So we got with staff, with legal and Mr. Donaldson and Mr. Stokas to talk about, our concern is how you identify any monies that you would want to offer toward this endeavor. And we believe that if we are structure this in such a way that it's toward economic development, that we could then tap into some of the federal funding that we anticipate that we'll see, and we could make some offer to the village from a monetary standpoint. I know Commissioner Jenkins, you've been talking about roughly $300,000, and so, but again, we would have a separate agreement that would lay that out. And you were talking about wanting a 5-year plan, so we would have an interlocal with the village if they were amenable to it, and we would make it very clear that these monies are to be used toward some form of economic development. So whether it's an infrastructure, water and sewer, whatever the desire is of the village, we don't want to get that specific, but it would be specific to economic development. And that will help us, because others are going to come forward and say, hey, what about me? But again, if it's an economic development project, then we believe it has merit to it and would help the village. So that's kind of where we landed on it. I know some of you have had other conversations with some of their council members, and this keeps bouncing around, but that's where I think we were comfortable, and Ms. Woods was comfortable.
I think it is a community that is in dire need of improvements and has challenges. And I think this is something that the rest of the county can accept, rather than somehow we would, which I was never in favor of, we would create a discounted fire service MSTU out there when everybody else, and then the rest of the county's got to make it up.
Yes, sir.
That's not in any way acceptable to me or anybody else in the unincorporated Martin County. So this is a way that we can help Indiantown build some of the things that was part of the reason why they became incorporated. And it'll tie us to our fire rescue for 5 years. Anyway, so I think it's a good idea. I wish I would have come up with it. Somebody in the room came up with that, Mr. Stokas, and I think it's in my mind, it's doable. Yeah.
So how would you like for us to proceed?
Well, I'd like to make sure that the rest of my commissioners are behind it, and then direct staff to make it help. So,
Commissioner Smith?
And I know this is the first time I'm hearing of it, so not caught off guard, but just haven't processed it yet for 2 seconds. I think one thing that would be important to think about with this is that I know you said you didn't want to narrow it down too much, but I think you should narrow it down some.
Okay.
I think just opening up and having it wide open will lead to someone questioning later on, was the intent. I mean, I really thought the other day we gave clear direction to send a letter, and I guess we didn't do that. So the intent idea from what 5 of us thought we heard, and even the expressions over there, were that we were going to send a letter in support of the Guardians. That was a simple letter that 5 of us talked about. So 5 years from now, or 4 years from now, and we're turning over, is the idea to turn over funds and let them do as they wish with them?
within
Or are we, that's where I would say I would have some sort of a, some parameters.
Okay.
And I
just for $300,000, they could throw that at their water plant just to provide fire flow for
They
economic
absolutely
development.
could, or they could throw it at something that we didn't think was the right thing to throw it at. That's, I guess, so if it's the water plant, if it's roads, if it's parks, and now when we're talking about economic development, I'm not sure how that fits that definition, but the water and sewer probably does. Maybe
Yes.
roads do, but I just, and do we literally, in your mind, do we literally just turn the money over every year? Or do they come to us with some kind of, this is what we're looking to put it towards this year thing?
Trying to make it least complicated.
I understand. I wished we'd had this conversation before, because
Well,
I've asked most of this,
I don't particularly care
not
for
with you.
surprises that aren't on the agenda either, but this is a little bit time sensitive that we need to
I just
put that out there so we can come to some kind of conclusion with Indiantown. But if you've got some language that you'd like to,
I would suggest this, maybe, perhaps, and I'm sure they want to do what they want to do yesterday with the fire rescue thing. When's our next meeting?
May. Yeah.
I would very much like some time to talk to Taryn about it, and
May
then come
11th.
back with something that you or everybody agrees for language that we say, here's what we're proposing exactly, and this is how it's defined.
I mean,
And
we don't even know at this point whether or not it's acceptable to them. They have a meeting next week, I think.
yeah, I think so.
say what?
They didn't have, no, I'm not sure.
Well, they had a meeting this past Thursday, so
Yeah, so it's
I
probably
think they're 2 weeks out.
Could we maybe get consensus whether, just
The
an
concept.
economic development, incentive would be something that we would be, we would present to them to see if they're interested, and with that, it would come back, with some fine tuning in the interlocal agreement on exactly how those parameters.
And this is tied to fire rescue, how exactly?
They wouldn't be tied together. They would be two independent agreements. So you'd have on one hand the interlocal agreement for economic development funds on a 5-year basis. But at the same time, there would also be an amendment to our fire rescue interlocal agreement where the Village of Indiantown would commit and agree to a 5-year fire rescue MSTU opt-in. So we would have an agreement.
Are we going to have a contract with them? I mean, how?
We have an interlocal.
Two different interlocals. They're related to each other, but legally, we would keep them separate from each other. They're not one agreement, it's two agreements.
So what do we have currently?
Currently, we have an ordinance and an interlocal agreement which allows the village to terminate at any time upon the appropriate notice. I think you have to give May 1st, you have to give a 1-year notice because of the requirements of the municipal service taxing unit.
And so what would be different in this new agreement?
They wouldn't have that ability to terminate for 5 years.
And what holds anybody to that? I mean, they're a municipality. I'm just where we are currently, and now we're throwing this out there as a something. I don't know what prevents them from coming back next year and saying, hey, thanks a lot, but we still want to do what we want to
Well,
do.
the agreement wouldn't allow it. We haven't gone far enough to see if the ordinance could prohibit it as well. Again, this came up, we didn't have board direction, so if it's the will of the board, I'm happy to do further research. But
For a whole host of I'd love to talk to you all about it. I'm not opposed to it. I'm cautiously curious.
Well, I think we need a consensus from the board to be able to tell Indiantown this is what's on the table. So at that point, we get some direction from them, whether it's practical or acceptable, and then we proceed with the details. Right now, it would be potentially a wasted effort to make staff go through all the due diligence of coming up with these agreements if they just blow us off and not interested, right? So if we could somehow, I don't know how to formulate I'm sorry.
No, I'm good.
Oh, when shouldn't you're Commissioner Hurd.
Yeah, every applicant for these federal dollars is required to come to us with a justification for their project, why they should receive a portion of these federal dollars. And it seems to me that in this instance, we're making an exception. We're saying, we'll just give you $300,000 and you can tell us what you're going to do with it. And that's not the way that these federal dollars are supposed to work. So I have a real reluctance to, it looks like a handout without justification to me. I'm sure that there's some projects in Indiantown that would qualify, but before I'm going to sign on to that, I need to know what they are.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Campy?
Thank you. Commissioner Jenkins, thank you for bringing this up. Several of us had gone out to Indiantown, individual, separate from each other, and met with residents out there in the coming weeks. I think this is such an important issue, especially for the folks that are personally affected, whether they are residents of Indiantown or our county residents who live near the incorporated boundary. So I'm happy that you brought it up this morning. I think it is a very time-sensitive issue. It is not only fractured a very solid community who historically does not have these type of problems, but it's also fractured, sadly, our relationship with a incorporated entity within Martin County, which I also don't believe we've really had a lot of those situations. I respect the members of the Indiantown Council, but I also want to reassure the Indiantown residents and our residents that we are working on this very quickly. I think based on what I've heard this morning, we can craft a motion to direct staff, because as Mrs. Wood said, May 1st is a deadline. And so if we don't meet again until the 11th and they have meetings, we need to give them some direction from us to our staff, through our staff, on what we're willing to do or not do. So I think that the concept of giving them some form of funding, which obviously between Ms. Krista and Mr. Stokas, Mr. Donaldson, the original ideas that were put out on the table very quickly seemed like they had merit, but as our professional staff had an opportunity to dig in a little bit, realized not only may that not be functionally appropriate, it might not be legally appropriate or doable. So this concept that you guys crafted together works for me. But I agree with Commissioner Smith and Commissioner Hurd that we cannot just say, here is X amount of dollars to use for economic development. I agree that economic development is important, especially in Indiantown. That was one of the cornerstones of the reason they wanted to be incorporated. However, it is a very general term. So I think since this all is coming from the fact that they were looking at specifically fire rescue services to create their own, I would make a proposal that the $300,000 be used each year for the term in some aspect that would enhance their ability to offer fire rescue services. We have talked about their water flow. I know that they've recently purchased their utility. I know that that is a tremendous undertaking that will be very expensive and has a tremendous amount of moving parts that they'll have to put a lot of money towards. If we suggested that money that we give go to the utility specifically for enhancement of water flow, I think that would just be a small portion of what they'll need to do that. So at least Commissioner Hurd and Commissioner Smith can understand that it's narrowed right into something very specific. Commissioner Hurd is right. No one is allowed to ask for funds from us, the state, or the federal government without giving very specific prerequisites on how the money will be used and then proving that the money was indeed used for that purpose. With all due respect to our colleagues in Indiantown, we are under the same responsibility from the state and the federal government. I don't think it's disrespectful in the least. And I know, having spoken to several of their council members, they are as anxious to put this issue behind them as we are, for the good of the residents. Because when you talk to senior citizens or business owners, and we didn't even discuss three-letter company that's out there who has not necessarily weighed in on this publicly, but they will. And none of us can afford to disrupt that FPL apple cart. I think that it's important that we act. So, Commissioner Jenkins, this was your idea. You hold a majority of the district out there. I hold the rest. If you would make a motion to that, I would gladly second it.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion that the county administrator offer to the Village of Indiantown a annual grant of $300,000 that is to be directed towards enhancement of their fire rescue delivery, water, fire flow from their utility. Which honestly, this is not, and so it's. And then would it be appropriate also hold the thought for a minute that if they did have some other project that was, that would qualify under these monies, that they would then come to us, right, for approval, but they could, at their discretion, specifically spend this money towards fire flow. Does that work?
We have a couple questions on the floor with Commissioner Smith.
Ed, thank you. I really sort of like the direction this is going in, and I think the other was a little, for me, too broad. What I like about this, and Ed's absolutely right, if you have a really antiquated utilities delivery system, if the intent of this is to secure our fire rescue delivery to Indiantown, which I think is what probably most residents would rather have, then us committing funds to enhancing the delivery of additional service that enhances our service from a safety aspect, I think makes an awful lot of sense.
Yes.
Harold, I think that $300,000 can get eaten up in a blink. I don't know that for 5 years there'll be a lot of money left over at the end of it all. I think of just one, as Ed was walking us through this idea. Thank you, Ed. And I'm giving you a prop for that. That was good.
Thank you very much.
If and when the fairgrounds is to happen, the cost of running utilities to that property will eat up probably all of that. But I think of the neighborhoods that don't have, adequate fire hydrants, don't have whatever would really enhance our fire rescue department going out and making sure that our residents were safer. I think is a really super good idea. So I can support that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And hopefully Indiantown will think that that's something that's worthy of discussing.
Good, thank you.
And I'll second Harold's motion for that.
Okay. Commissioner Hurd.
This is one of the challenges of one-time grants, is that they're not reoccurring. So my understanding is that now the proposal is not to allow Indiantown to apply for a portion of these federal grant dollars, COVID-related dollars for infrastructure, which is appropriate, but rather to assure them a reoccurring $300,000 grant per year for 5 years, so $1.5 million. What's the source of the recurring funding? It's not 300 anymore. That was the proposal that Commissioner Jenkins came up with at first. Now it's $1.5 million. So tell me where that $1.5 million is going to come from, and tell me what Indiantown needs to do in order to qualify.
Well, we're anticipating, the documentation that we've seen, that the grant, that's coming down is split into 2 years. And so we would allocate that $1.5 million from those 2 years, whether we'd probably peel off $750 each year and set it aside so that we've got those recurring funds.
So we're taking away funding before people have had an opportunity to apply. we're committing that funding before we've even gotten an application.
Well, we have to plan, Commissioner. I mean,
How much is the funding each year?
Your total, George Stokas, Assistant County Administrator, your total allocation from the federal government's approximately $31.5 million through ARP. Indiantown will also be getting,
like,
I want to say about $6 million. I don't quote me on that number. So they will.
Right.
It's more of an entitlement grant. So what I would foresee here is by all means, I think what staff's looking for is direction to go ahead and begin the communication with Indiantown, and then we would probably, my interpretation would be, we would come back with a list of projects and the estimated amount, probably from engineering estimates, as to what, from what I'm hearing from the board, for fire protection that would be related to economic development, and we would be coming back with approximately at $300,000 a year for 5 years at $1.5 million. So you're not limiting or restricting people from applying. What you're doing is you're allocating or setting aside a specific amount of money to go towards a specific area in the county.
Which is already getting $6 million. And therefore, if you take another $1.5 million, then that's $1.5 million projects that are in unincorporated that won't be funded. There won't be enough funds. It seems to me that this is not judicious. It's creating an exception to our rules for qualifying for these grants before anybody makes application, and that doesn't sound like it doesn't meet the intent of the federal funding.
well, we believe the economic.
We can't set aside pet projects just because.
Well, Commissioner, all I can, again, I mean, I value your opinion on this matter. What staff, I think, was trying to accomplish is, we do know through the act that was passed through the federal government, is that we do have to allocate that money to COVID-impacted communities, as well as the act does provide and direct right now that staff should be looking at the investment in infrastructure, which would be water and sewer. And by all means, I do not have the full deck here today sitting here. We have not received the guidance from the federal government. We will be coming back to you all with that. I think just the intent here was to try to come up with a solution. We tried to be judicious. The reason we kind of looked at economic development in Indiantown is they are one of the few places in the county that has pretty much a permit ready industrial area, as well as they have an industrial base. It wasn't looking at it necessarily. I mean, from my economic development lenses, it was looking at, okay, where could you make an investment and then see a return on the investment in probably the shortest amount of time with the least amount of capital environmental impact, and that's kind of how we got to this. I do apologize for not coming before you all. When we came up with the idea, it was very
Last minute.
I hate to say that, but it was kind of last minute. It wasn't just off the cuff, but it is. But I do believe this is just the beginning, and we will have to come back to you all with probably a plan and a list of the projects, and very similar to what we do with our capital improvement program. And that's really how we got to where we were at.
Well, and Commissioner.
So we don't have a plan, and yet you're intending now to put it into an interlocal that we're obligated to for 5 years, and we don't even have a plan yet.
Commissioner Hurd, Commissioner Jenkins, and Commissioner Campy have been immersed, as well as Commissioner Hetherington, because her family lives out there. And they're hearing from the residents that they're asking the county to please do something that would help the situation. And so that's what the commissioners are trying to do. They're trying to accomplish that objective for those residents, particularly that are out there, or people passing through the area, quite frankly.
But we can't do that at the expense of all the other residents. We can't subsidize one group at the expense of all the rest.
Commissioner Campy, yes.
Thank you very much. A couple of points that were happening as I was listening to my colleagues and staff. First off, Mr. Stokas, I would not apologize or say tag this conversation as last-minute planning. It's real-time planning. These things are happening in real time. It's not like you had all this information and you sat on it. It's not like you understood that there was a critical situation happening and you did nothing. You and Ms. Krista and our team are working in real time, which is how most negotiations actually work. as you hear additional information, as certain suggestions vet out either good ideas or don't work. That's how it works. And let's be clear, the negotiations have already begun. What we are discussing right now is 100% being watched by the manager and the Village Council of Indiantown. We are at the negotiation table right this minute. So with that in mind, I would caution all of my colleagues to at least think and frame what we're discussing in a way that will be at least reasonable to our colleagues in Indiantown, so that we don't torpedo the negotiations by sending missives west and then emotions take over and we're not able to rationally negotiate. Secondly, I would say that if there were no federal funds coming, we are still in this very position that we're in today. When I originally heard the concept of us doing a $300,000 per year for X amount of years, I did not in my mind assume that the money was coming from the federal grant money that's flowing down. I'm happy if you're able to work that into it. We all have our opinions on how busy the printing machines in Washington, D.C. are. We all have our opinions on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but that ship has already sailed. So if $31 million is coming to Martin County, which Indiantown, just like Stewart, Jupiter Island, Sewell's Point, and Ocean Breeze, is also part of Martin County. So I try in my mind not to separate them out. We're not talking about St. Lucie County. We're talking about Indiantown. We would still be figuring out a way, or at least asking staff to figure out a way to find an acceptable amount of funding that would go to Indiantown so that they would take the concept of privatizing and volunteering their fire rescue and emergency services. That's what my thought is today. The good news about if we qualify to use some of the federal funding towards this endeavor, infrastructure is 100% on that list. The other advantage to infrastructure is it is completely tied into economic development, because just imagine for a moment if you were either an existing business looking to relocate to Indiantown or an entrepreneur trying to start a business in Indiantown, part of your due diligence would be, is my facility going to be protected by legitimate, adequate fire rescue services? Are my employees that could potentially get injured or sick on my work site, are they going to be appropriately protected by a legitimate fire rescue and emergency service organization? That's the answer is yes. So economic development will be completely, in my opinion, completely hamstrung by a volunteer fire force and a contracted emergency services. So with all due respect to Commissioner Hurd, this is not a giveaway. These are members of our community. We're in negotiation. No one in their right mind goes to a negotiating table thinking that they will win everything and that it will cost them nothing. $300,000 to me is a reasonable amount of money to offer to other residents of Martin County. If we're going to eventually have these same conversations with the city of Stewart, we're going to eventually have these same conversations with Sewell's Point. We have had these conversations with Jupiter Island. It's not new. It's not like the folks in Indiantown are asking for something that these other three communities that I've mentioned have already asked us for. This is part of negotiating where a nearly $500 million operation to ask our staff to put up $300,000 a year to take this terrible issue of privatizing Indiantown, and not just Indiantown. Remember, Western Martin County unincorporated residents will suffer the consequences of the decisions that we make today. If your motion still stands, I would second it, and after hearing some comment, call to question on how do we send our staff over to legitimately negotiate with another elected body. Thank you.
Okay, Mary Kay, do we have a second already on
Yes,
the motion?
me. I'm the second.
Oh,
Well, yes,
Doug's-
actually,
I seconded it before you even made it.
before the motion was made. but
Correct.
Commissioner Smith seconded.
Okay, so,
Commissioner Campbell has
I'm
seconded.
seconding it
Okay,
to
so
send a message to our constituents.
okay.
So Commissioner Hurd,
Mr. Jenkins.
alluding to the fact that we're not being fiscally responsible with our CARES money, and it's just, imagine them us not being able to collect the MSTU in Indiantown, the 4.6 million, I believe it is. Imagine us having to now contemplate building a new fire station on Fox Brown Road. Imagine us now having the logistics issue of dealing with our residents that are on the other side of Indiantown all the way to the lake. It just would seem to me that the most fiscally responsible thing we can do is try to cut a deal. Because I would assume, I mean, I'm pretty good with math, but $300,000, $1.5 million, I think that would be a much larger impact than $1.5 million over 5 years. So I think this is something that we can put on the table, that they can accept, and we can put this to bed. I don't know if you've been watching the turmoil between residents in Indiantown right now. This needs to stop. We need to bring this to fruition here. So that's
Thank you,
that's my
Commissioner
motion
Jenkins.
stands.
So we have a motion on the floor by Commissioner Jenkins, seconded by Commissioner Campy. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 4-1 with Commissioner Hurd dissenting.